Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, featuring Rory McDonald. Rory is a member of the Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship faculty here at the Darden School of Business, and he and I recently connected to talk more about his background, what led him to Darden, the classes he teaches, his research interests, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. Remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rory McDonald. So, Rory, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Sure, happy to. So start at the beginning. So my wife Ann and I are originally from Florida. We went to the University of South Florida in Tampa. I think that was the first person that wrote into the chat. I'm an engineer by training. Did my undergraduate and master's degree in engineering. My wife and I got married. We moved out to the West Coast, where I did my MBA and PhD at Stanford. I worked in engineering, marketing, and sales before founding a venture-backed technology company that was spun out of Stanford University. I was telling Brett earlier that the company's become quite successful, but I always wanted to be a teacher. And so I figured that I should probably start at some point. And so as my co-founder continued to run the company, I went back to get, on after the MBA to get a doctorate. In retrospect, I'm not sure that was the most financially sound career decision that I made at the time. After all, at that point, my wife and I had 4 children when we did this. But in some ways, I'm glad I did it that way because I brought with me a set of ideas that I probably wouldn't have had if I had just gone straight through in academia. And I'm excited to share some of those ideas with my students and my colleagues. So spent graduate school at Stanford, taught at the University of Texas in Austin for a couple of years in the management department. And then I joined the faculty at Harvard Business School in the Technology and Operations Management unit, where I taught the core operations class and a elective that I developed called Disruptive Strategy. And then I came to Darden a few years ago to visit first as a faculty member, and then ultimately joined the faculty full-time 2 years ago. And so I've been here for the last 2 years, and it's been absolutely fantastic. And so now our kids are mostly grown, and our daughter is the only one that's going to be at home next year. So it's going to be weird to have an only child after so many years with so many kids in the house. So that's me and my background.
Thank you, Rory. And what attracted you to Darden, and what have you enjoyed about being at Darden?
Yeah, so much. So actually my first kind of introduction to Darden was when I was in the Technology and Operations Management unit at Harvard. Yael came and joined the faculty with us for a couple of years. And so I got to know her very well while she was there. And, I think she loved being at Harvard, but she raved about Darden. And so, and she raved about all the things there, the students, the faculty. And so when I came and did the visiting, I think I already had kind of high expectations. And, many of the things are very similar to Harvard in terms of the case method and the focus on management practice and the emphasis on teaching and development. And so that part of it kind of came very easily. I think the best part has definitely been the students. And I teach a lot in all the different programs, but maybe more recently, more in kind of the part-time in the MBA program. And I think the students have, they have a lot of really interesting work experience, and B, they're doing that work at the moment that you're, teaching whatever it is that you're teaching. So there's I think a one-to-one mapping between what's going on in their world and what we're kind of learning together. And so I think I've really enjoyed that. And then from a colleague standpoint, I think the one really cool thing about Darden is it's small enough to where everybody sort of knows each other. And so I just remember the first faculty meeting I went to, there was all this laughing and joking and talking with one another. And it's clear that the faculty knew each other on kind of a very deep level. And that's nothing that I had ever historically experienced in my career. And so I think, students and faculty are the things that really attracted me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And for folks who are wondering, who's Yael, well, she does go by one name basically here at the Darden School, but Yael Grushka-Kane, she is the leader of the full-time MBA program. She had been previously the leader of the professional degree program. So I got a chance to get to know her well in that role. And she's great, tons of energy. She teaches a project management elective. She teaches core as well in the operations area, think, fit, and decision analysis. I should note. great person to know and a lot of energy. So Rory, you mentioned that you were the technology and operations faculty at Harvard, and yet now you're teaching strategy. What do you enjoy about teaching strategy?
Yeah, so I love strategy. My PhD is actually the emphasis is on strategy, and I kind of once I made the decision to become a business school professor, I sort of joke that nobody got up in the morning and went to undergrad and said, I want to be a business school faculty, right? I think for most of us, the career sort of finds us. And that was true for me in terms of wanting to be a professor. And then the question was, which area within, the broader landscape of business academia do you want to do? And there's lots of ones that I think would have been maybe a little bit closer to my background as an engineer, maybe, operations management, those types of things. But I just loved strategy, and I loved the fact that it's kind of an integrating mechanism within the organization. In other words, it's very difficult to make a strategic decision if you don't also incorporate financial, accounting, marketing, operations, leadership considerations. And so it's really a general management job is to do the strategy of the organization. And I think also strategy, if you think about what sort of defines strategy as a field, it's all about trying to understand the drivers of firm performance. I think one of the reasons that we appreciate certain organizations more than others is they find a way to build a sustainable competitive advantage, even in very difficult market settings. And so the reality is some organizations perform better than others. And I'm really interested in why that is and how that is and what we can learn from those organizations and what we can learn from the organizations that maybe don't perform as well so that we can set ourselves up for success by developing viable strategies.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I think a strategy is like the course in the core curriculum that a lot of MBA students are looking forward to. Like they thought that this is what they're going to be taking when they come to an MBA program. And I know we were talking earlier as we were preparing for this call. Even our prospective student visitors, when they come and sit on a strategy class, they're so excited to be in strategy. It must be nice to be teaching in an area where people have so much energy and interest in the topic.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think too, obviously we love all the classes that are offered, but there are some classes where having a certain background or expertise is especially useful. Think about a very technical topic, for example. And so, the Darden faculty do a fantastic job of bringing everybody up to speed, including those who may not have, let's say, finance or accounting backgrounds. But I think one thing that's nice about strategy is I think you can engage kind of immediately, kind of wherever you're coming from. And so I think that tends to be a class that we send visitors to. I just had a student in my core strategy class last night who I knew from the year prior because he was a prospective student and came to visit our classroom and wanted to see what all this, case-based, student-centered learning was about. Now, the downside was it was the same, it was the same case that we were doing last night that he had come to before. So he kind of knew the outcome. But I think everybody knew the outcome because it was a case on MoviePass. So this is obviously an organization that infamously, had a really compelling service for their customers from a financial standpoint, but really missed out on a lot of opportunities to capture value and ultimately, went out of business.
Yeah, I guess people do know how that story ends, but man, what a great time it was for the handful of months when MoviePass was available.
That's right. I asked the students, if they were, had been members of MoviePass, and I always get a few hands every year and said, I just looked at the numbers and I said, I have to sign up for this. I don't even go to the movies that much, but if I go more than twice in during the month, I've made money on this.
Yeah, it was a little too good to be true, so it turns out. So what do you enjoy about teaching through the case method and being in a classroom and leading these discussions?
Yeah, I think that the case method is a really interesting way to, first of all, pedagogically, we know that if you think about business education, putting yourself in the shoes of a protagonist that has to make a decision under uncertainty and practicing doing that over and over and over again across different scenarios is really one of the few ways that you can get good at this, right? We say that a lot of business is basically decision making under uncertain environments and rapidly changing environments. And so how do you get good at that. I was an engineer growing, in undergrad. And, if you want to get good at chemistry or physics or math or whatever else, there's a set curriculum by which you are, kind of moving up the chain in terms of knowledge in those fields. And as a result, there's a lot of lecture and you learn a lot from reading the textbook and lectures from the professors. But I think when it comes to business, the student-centered learning and the case-based decision-making forces you to sort of put yourself in the shoes of that protagonist and make a decision under uncertainty with limited information. And we can all go back and play Monday morning quarterback and say all the things that they did right or wrong, but that's not going to help us when it comes to the decisions that we need to make right now. And so I think that's one of the things I like about it. I think the other thing I like about it is maybe a little bit selfishly from a faculty standpoint is, I might teach the same case, 3 or 4 times in a given year. And what's really remarkable is how different the discussion unfolds in the classroom setting. And that's as a result of people having different backgrounds and bringing different experience to the problem. And so you might, think a conversation is going to evolve in a particular way. And obviously as faculty, we think hard about what the message should or could be when students, leave that day. But in the interim, in terms of how we get there, the tributaries that we go off on, or somebody brings up an issue that, I've taught the case for 10 times and I've never heard that issue before. That's, a unique insight. And you can just see all the classroom members nodding, in agreement or approval, or that insight has sort of registered in their minds too. So I like the variety of it, and then I think also I like the energy of it. When we come into the classroom and 50 people have all kind of read the same case and all have different points of view, and maybe have done their study groups, their learning groups ahead of time. Just the amount of energy that's in the room that we can sort of tap into is a wonderful experience.
Yeah, that is awesome, and I always encourage folks to come and observe it. It's one thing for us to describe it, but you can come for a class visit, be it in Charlottesville or here in Roslyn, and sit in. It really does help animate your understanding of what this is, and I think for a lot of people, it gets them excited about learning at Darden. So let's talk about strategy a little bit more. How do you see this course fitting into the overall core curriculum? Everybody here at Darden takes a core before they move into electives. There's 10 subject areas that they'll engage with. Strategy is one of them. How does this fit into the curriculum?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're always kind of evolving the curriculum. In the part-time program, which I've been teaching strategy most recently, strategy is taught near the end of their experience in the core. And I see it fitting in as, maybe every professor sees their course this way, but I see my course as sort of a capstone course in the sense that I said earlier, it's hard to make a strategic decision without incorporating all of the other considerations within the organization, the ops, the marketing, the leadership, the, decision analysis, accounting and finance. And so you don't want to make a decision that's good from a leadership perspective, but very bad from a net present value perspective from finance. And so your job as a strategist is to incorporate all of these other considerations and then, make a decision that's hopefully related to driving better firm performance. And so we think about it as a capstone. It's an integrative course. But it's also a course that allows them to practice using the tools and frameworks from the other courses that they've taken. I'll give you a good example. Last night we did a case on Boeing versus Airbus and the decisions about the product decisions from those two companies. So here you have, aircraft manufacturing, essentially a duopoly in the early 1990s, and you have decisions about what kinds of planes to build. There's a lot of uncertainty around demand. There's a lot of uncertainty around the kind of price that you might get. There's a lot of uncertainty around the technology that you need to use. But ultimately, you're evaluating the project on whether or not it's a positive NPV project. Well, this is really interesting, right? Because in a duopoly, what your best move is depends upon what your competitor does. So you could have a positive NPV project in isolation, but as soon as you incorporate the perspective of what your competitor might be doing, all of a sudden that changes. Well, now I, as a strategist, need to take into account sustainable competitive advantage, which is what I care about, but also the NPV of the project, which is clearly drawing from finance. And so that's kind of an example of where you might incorporate different perspectives in trying to make the best decision about driving for performance.
What's the decision that has to be made in that case?
Yeah, sure.
Where's the focus?
I'm a little bit hesitant here, right, Brett? Because when we get feedback on the course, I can predict with perfect certainty some of the feedback, right? The classic feedback is, it would be nicer to have newer cases, and I would say we have 4 or 5 cases written within that year, so we certainly are attuned to that. But sometimes there are pedagogical trade-offs between having a kind of a rich historical case where we have a lot of detail on what the firms did and their pricing decisions and stuff like that so that we can illustrate a concept. Right. To me, the perfect case is number one, it's relevant to the student's experience. Number two, it's interesting and new. And number three, it perfectly illustrates the theory, framework, or tool that we're trying to illustrate throughout the course. And so I say all this as a caveat to this is a case based in 1992 where Airbus is deciding whether or not to build a new super jumbo plane, which is a plane that's 300 seats or above. And there's all kinds of factors to consider about that, right? We go through discussions about, is the demand there for this? How risky is this decision? Financially, will we lose money or will we make money on this? And then ultimately, there's a question about game theory, which is what I build is dependent upon what my beliefs are and what I think my competitor also believes. And so I'm putting myself in the shoes of my competitor and reasoning accordingly. And so we can have a rich debate in the class. Last night, we had about 2/3 of people that said, hey, we should absolutely build this. Another third that said we absolutely should not build this. And what was interesting is the reasonings, students came up with. So I had a student who's a former current venture capitalist who talked about that they should build it because this is Airbus should build it because they have the backing of European governments and government subsidies, and therefore they're not subject to, traditional market forces. And I said, oh my goodness, the venture capitalist is talking about government subsidies. This could only ever happen in kind of a student-centered learning environment where we're sort of put all in one room and asked to have this discussion. So it was a very rich and meaningful discussion last night.
That does sound like a really, really good conversation. And yeah, I know it has to be interesting as a faculty member. No two case discussions are quite the same. You also teach a couple of electives. You mentioned you developed the strategy course while you were at Harvard. You have disruptive strategy here at Darden, as well as disruptive innovation. Can you tell us a little bit more about the disruptive strategy course?
Yeah, sure. So, a few years ago, I co-developed a course with Clayton Christensen, who was, kind of a leader in management education for a long period of time. I think he was the world's leading management thinker for like 5 years in a row or something like that. And so I always joke that, the students don't get that person, that they get, his protege. So they get some version of what that course with him would have been like. But we co-developed the course, and the idea was, hey, leaders who aspire to run a successful enterprise, they have to develop a winning business formula. And that's really tough to do. It's really tough to build a successful enterprise. But the reward for doing so is that you then must spot when external conditions require you to change the formula. And ironically enough, the more successful the business is, the harder that is to pull off. And so disruptive strategy is really about not just building, but sustaining a successful organization in the context of a variety of disruptive forces that organization encounters. So you think about new technologies coming into the market. You think about competitors, you think about customer tastes changing, maybe even regulations change. And so the formula that made you successful in the past might actually dull your response to some of these forces in the present. And the course is about getting around those forces, understanding those forces, looking at how those forces, impact my decision making as an innovating manager. And ultimately, the goal is to sustain a successful enterprise, which means innovation and growth. And so we do that course, and we developed it as a semester long course. And then, of course, when I came to Darden, we're on a quarter system, which I think has all kinds of benefits. But there is one drawback, which is you can't really. It's harder to teach a semester course. And so what I did is I took that course and I divided it into two. The first half is called Disruptive Strategy: Building and Sustaining a Successful Enterprise, and the second half is Disruptive Innovation: Winning in New Markets and Product Categories. But essentially, it's the same kind of course architecture throughout. And I think I've had, I just ran my first two versions of that, two cohorts of that, where students have take the strategy course with me. If they want to, they take the disruptive strategy course, then they can also take the disruptive innovation course.
Very cool. What's an example of a case you read in the disruptive strategy course?
Yeah, let me think about what would be a great illustration of one. So we read one, and now I'm worried that I'm gonna give you too many dated examples. Well, let me give you one that we did the other night, which was we did a case about Pandora music streaming, right? So this is the precursor to Spotify. And the students get to dig in a little bit to Pandora's business model. And Pandora, as some people will recall, was pursuing an advertising-based business model, which was super hot at the time. The idea was we're going to get a bunch of users onto our platform. Sounds familiar to some of the business models today. And then we're going to figure out how to monetize those users. And so in the case of Pandora, it's, hey, we've got this large engaged audience who like listening to music on our platform. How do we sell them ads and how do we sell them more ads? And so with Pandora, they got so popular that they were the number 2 app on the App Store. It was like Facebook was number 1 and Pandora was number 2. I think students come into the discussion saying, why are we talking about Pandora? Like clearly Spotify has, figured this out and Pandora hasn't. And so in the case, we sort of, we do the deep dive on Pandora. We look at some of the missed opportunities that they had from a revenue model and especially from a value capture model. And then, again, we're left at the end of the discussion with like, again, why are we doing this when Spotify clearly has this figured out? Now, the whole framework is around a particular idea about funding for new growth ventures. And it's called good money, bad money. And the argument is simple that when you're trying to build a new growth venture, good money is patient for growth and impatient for profit. I'll say that again. Patient for growth and impatient for profit. Now, the reasons for doing it that way is because if we're patient for growth and impatient for profit, it forces us to make some of those critical tests about the viability of our strategy and our business model early on. And it provides coverage when if the funding environment shifts, right? So the macroeconomic environment shifts, and instead of money being abundant and cheap, it is instead, scarce and expensive. We need to be able to get profitable now. Otherwise, we're at risk of being shut down. Now, Pandora did the opposite of that. They were impatient for growth and patient for profit. And then all of a sudden, 2008 came along, and that money spigot from the venture capitalists dried up, and they had to get profitable now. Well, they already had a model that they were scaling, and they were magnifying the losses in that model. And they never were sort of forced to figure out that critical test. So at the end of the case, we then discuss Spotify and say, clearly Spotify has it figured out. And we show Pandora's revenues over time, which just looks like a nice hockey stick, like you like to look at, with a growth company. And then you show the net income, and it's just like terrible, right? They're like losing money every year, and they're losing more money the more customers that they add. And so then we show the Spotify one, and it's similar. You get this nice hockey stick, they're generating revenue over time, and then you show net income, and it's also negative. So the only difference here apparently is that Spotify hasn't yet had that point where the money spigot has turned off such that it has to make money now. And it is, sensibly prioritizing growth, but it hasn't had to answer some of those critical tests around profitability. And I think the only time they were profitable was a couple of years ago, where they laid off like 20% of their staff, did a whole bunch of different things to get profitable that particular year. But I think that model is challenged. And so I think the students leave that session saying, maybe I need to, think a little bit harder about kind of the vulnerabilities of my business model, and maybe even be a little bit more critical towards some of the companies that we see today that are clearly prioritizing growth over profit. And we're not even sure if they have a viable profit formula.
That is really interesting because, I mean, just as you were describing that, I was thinking, Spotify, clearly category leader by some margin. I mean, you have Apple Music, you have some of these other things, but like Spotify does seem to be the dominant brand in the streaming services for music, and yet still challenged to make a profit.
That's right. Yeah. And I don't see, if I look over the next couple of years, I'm not sure what they're going to do differently. Because any sort of, thing that they might do might also slow down their growth, right? Because from a customer standpoint, there are trade-offs for things like, introducing more ads and the customer experience. And so you might want to do something that will allow you to capture more value, but that actually might cost you in the customer experience and therefore the growth opportunities.
Hmm. Oh, well, tell us about the disruptive innovation course. Curious about that one as well.
Yeah, so the disruptive innovation course is navigating new markets and product categories. And so disruptive strategy is a bit more about large established organizations that are facing that, are they getting disrupted, right? And they're trying to stave off disruption and reinvent themselves in the context of disruption. And then the disruptive innovation course is kind of putting yourself more in the shoes of the startup who's trying to be the disruptor and try to become that category leader in the new market. And so that course, if you think about the first course, disruption is your enemy, unless you can sort of understand it and harness it. The second course is disruption is your friend, because it gives you an unfair advantage vis-a-vis the incumbents that might be operating in the markets that you want to tackle. And so we always say, increase your odds of competitive success by taking a disruptive strategy. We're trying to explain this weird phenomenon that happens in business that we shouldn't see, which is we have all these companies, these leading companies, resources, market power, brands, smart people, and yet they get challenged and they lose their market leading position. And oftentimes they get challenged and lose their market leading position by an upstart that seemingly has none of those advantages. If you think about it logically, it shouldn't happen. David should not be able to beat Goliath. And yet it happens again and again across industries. And the question is, how does that happen? And if I'm a David, right, how do I do this? How can I be successful in a market that is dominated by these deep-pocketed incumbents? And we say, well, we're going to teach you how to create a disruptive strategy. So that's what that course is about.
What's a case you read in that course?
Yeah. So one of the ones that I like a lot that we do a mix in Darden of field cases and cases that are library based. The field cases are ones where we kind of go out and we do interviews with the protagonists of the company, and so we have that we really get the kind of the general management perspective there. So one of the ones that we did a couple of years ago was a company called Parrot Drones. So Parrot was the pioneer of the consumer drone market. It was, I think, maybe 2009, 2010. They launched the first consumer drone, and they were in a totally different business before this. They were making Bluetooth car kits for people's phones. And they pivoted from that, which was an industry in a market that was commoditizing, to something else. And their CEO, Henri Seydoux, is just an unbelievably interesting entrepreneur. So we went to Paris, we interviewed him. And he basically said, like, what are we good at as an organization? Well, we're good at technology, and we're especially good at Bluetooth technology, which is, creating devices that connect to consumers' phones. And so he said to himself, what else could we create, right? And I think he created like a musical instrument that people could like sort of control on their phone. He created a set of Bluetooth speakers before those became a thing. And then the third thing he created was a Bluetooth car that you could control via your phone. And he watched his son play with it, and he said, that isn't super compelling, but what if I could make a Bluetooth helicopter? And so he created the first consumer drone, and it was released at the Consumer Electronics Show. It was a runaway success. People were super interested in it. Like, oh my goodness, I've got this thing that I can take out of the box and make it fly, just using my phone to control this. And he was basically, printing money for 3 years as he was the leader and the only company in this category. Well, then 3 years later, DJI comes along, which is the Chinese competitor that comes to the market, and they come into the market with a drone that is, I think it's maybe the Phantom or the Phantom Two. It's 3 times the price of Parrot's drone. And it's 3 years after Parrot is the market leader in the only one in the market. And they basically just completely swamp Parrot. And the case is focused around, okay, now that you're Parrot, what do you do? And first of all, how did this happen to us, given that we were the market leader and the only one in this category? And then now that it's happened to us, how can we sort of, get ourselves out of this mess? Like, what could we do? Where could we invest? How could we pivot in order to get away from DJI? And so that's what that particular case is about.
Golly, well, I did not know that much about the drone market, but it's amazing to see a company be overtaken by a competitor with a much more expensive product that also is, they're new to market. So their company's been around for 3 years,
Sure.
established in the market. Like, what are the forces that allow that to happen?
Yeah, so we dig into a few of those. One of the things that ends up happening in the case is, oftentimes if you are pioneering a new technology or you are in a new market segment, is you get a lot of unanticipated customers and unintended product uses, right? So you have an idea as an entrepreneur of the value proposition of your particular product or technology. And it may be the case that the customers see it that way too, but oftentimes they don't, right? And so you end up getting unexpected interest from unintended customers and unexpected product uses. So in the case of consumer drones, right, Henri thought that he saw the drone as a toy, right? This is primarily going to be interested to people that are hobbyists or enthusiasts to be able to play, with their friends, fly it around the room, etc. Meanwhile, DJI, I'm not sure they had this in their mind initially, but pretty soon after some of the market signals that they got, they realized that the killer app, that the killer use case was as a flying camera. And so at the time there was, YouTube was exploding. You had a lot of amateur filmmakers that were trying to, create films. And they found that DJI Phantom drone did an awesome job of allowing them to take, aerial photography and use it for their films. Now, imagine if you're a consumer and you're viewing that product in that new category as a toy versus a flying camera. All of the things that affects in your organization. It affects what aisle you sit in. It affects the willingness to pay of the customer, right? I'm willing to pay much more for a camera than I am for, a toy that, my kid is going to break in a short amount of time. And if I think about the path of innovation, DJI is saying like, okay, well, how can we make this a better flying camera? Well, we need to create longer range. We need to create a more stable camera. Meanwhile, Parrot is saying, if I'm just a toy, I need to make sure it's cheap, that it can fly out of the box. And, the things like range and picture quality on the camera aren't so important. And so here you have ostensibly two competitors in the same market, and yet the customers in that market view them differently. And as a result, they do a bunch of things differently from the organizational side that I think affects their ultimate trajectory in that market. Now, at the end of the case, Parrot is saying, all right, what do we do now? Where could we go to potentially escape the clutches of this, Chinese competitor? And so, not surprisingly, they pivot to military uses. And so those tend to be a market where I think people are a bit more skeptical of using, the DJI drone. And I think it also, even though it's a historical case in the sense that it came out a few years ago, we're able to connect with some things that are going on in the world right now, which obviously we're seeing all over the world, right? These cheap drones that are having unbelievable impact in a variety of different international conflicts.
Yeah, significantly disrupted military technology for sure. Um, I'm really curious, as somebody who's interested in strategy, innovation, disruption, what do you make of AI in all of this?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the cases I hesitated to tell you about or not was this, one that Jared Harris and I wrote. Jared is a faculty, a friend and colleague in the strategy, ethics, and entrepreneurship group at Darden. And we wrote a case called Consulting Confronts Generative AI. And it is basically, it's focused on McKinsey and a protagonist at McKinsey who is, thinking about how AI will or will not reshape the consulting business itself. And in that particular market, we take students through the history of consulting, and especially, I think the really surprising thing is how adept consulting industry is in particular, but individual consulting firms are at adapting to past technological shocks. So they adapted to the shock of the internet. It was like, hey, all of our clients are going to have access to all this information, and that previously was proprietary to us. Like, we might go out of business, right? And that A, that wasn't true, and B, not only was it not true, but consulting firms actually adapted, thrived, and grew in the context of that seemingly disruptive force that was, the internet in the mid 1990s. So then they've got, knowledge management later on, and then it's like technological platforms. And then most recently, the COVID shock, which is like, hey, this is our entire business. We go out to client sites, we understand their business at a deep level, and then we give them, recommendations on strategy. The pandemic shuts things down. Clearly, this technological shock is going to dramatically reshape and change the way that we operate as business. And you don't see that. And you also see the consulting firms, again, adapting, thriving, growing despite this technological shock. So then the question is, AI is kind of the most recent technological shock for the consulting industry. What will that mean for the industry going forward? Right. One pattern is, hey, it's going to play out exactly like we saw the last pattern of technological shocks. But another would be like, actually, there's something fundamentally different about the technology that may reshape the way our organizations are structured, that may reshape the way that we do work, and ultimately the way that we get paid for doing that work. And so as a result of kind of the influx of generative AI, we might actually have to rethink our business models in the context of AI. And so I think that was Jared and I, that was kind of our first foray into thinking about the intersection between, AI and strategy. And we've since been doing some kind of research in this area too, to try to understand how organizations are incorporating AI, AI's role in strategic decision making, either as a complement or a substitute to human decision making. Because we sort of see AI as a new technology coming in. We have a past playbook for how you deal with new technologies, but we tend to see organizations pull these new technologies in to help them do more and better at what they already do. Okay, so I'll say that again. They help them do more and better at what they already do, as opposed to new and different. That is, new customers and new revenue streams. And I think when I think about AI today, I think we're just scratching the surface at bringing AI into the organization, helping us do more and better at what we're already doing, more efficiently, more effectively. And maybe we're not thinking enough about new opportunities for new customers and new revenue streams that AI enables us to do things in our business models that we couldn't have done historically.
Yeah, that is interesting to think about. I mean, there's a lot of prognosticating right now about where AI is going, and you have, leaders of some of these companies saying, it's already surpassing humans' ability to do these kind of tasks, and it's not so much about coexisting as like this is going to be like this really disruptive moment where labor looks different and jobs look different and all of this, and we are trying to wrestle with this from a regulatory standpoint. And I mean, you have people talk about changing the tax code, and we've got to do all kinds of things to value human labor. Right now, there's perhaps an incentive for companies to think about, and these kind of technology innovations and incorporating them into the work stream, even from a tax standpoint. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you make of this conversation around AI?
Yeah. So, and maybe I'll pick up on the regulatory piece there a little bit. A former PhD student of mine, Chung Gao, he and I did some work together on trying to understand the regulation of new technologies. And so, one of the things I'm interested in from a strategy standpoint is, new technologies, new business models, new entrants into and new markets and categories being created. But a lot of times you face a challenge in those markets if you are a startup because you probably are the leading expert at understanding that technology and what it can do. And you understand it better than everybody else. And you would like to get to the point where you are influencing the regulatory environment in your favor, right? Because that will allow you to make money and stay in business. But that's really hard to do if you're a startup because if you're a large established organization, you have established tools of influence that you can use, right? You can lobby the government to get the regulations changed, or to get them more in your favor. You can use what's called the revolving door, where we have people kind of coming in and out from government to the private sector to help us kind of understand and maybe influence the regulatory environment. But as a startup, you can't actually wield those same tools of influence. And so if you think about most of the companies that are pushing AI, they were, and still some might consider them to be startup organizations. So again, they understand the technology at a deep level, but they don't necessarily have the tools of influence. So how do you create a regulatory structure? And what we see in our research is that some of these organizations do what we call forcing the conversation, right? Which is they maybe kind of move a little fast, break a few things, almost a little bit intentionally, not necessarily for nefarious reasons, but because we're scrambling for the regulatory environment to be clarified so that we all understand the rules of the game. And so by pushing the envelope a little bit, we get the regulators to pay attention and to sit down with us and co-create a regulatory structure that's going to work for everybody in that industry. And I think we're seeing that kind of play out with AI right now. Is there's so much, excitement and moving, but also pushback from the societal level saying, hey, we're going to do something about this, that the government is now stepping in and saying, okay, we need to put some structure around this. Let's sit down with the leaders of these organizations. Let's really try to understand the technology at a deep level, and let's get a regulatory framework that'll work for everybody.
Yeah, I think one of the things that feels part of this conversation, though, is maybe the sort of public concern, maybe distrust, maybe too strong a word, but public concern about our ability to regulate these kinds of new technologies, things that are moving this fast. I mean, you consider where ChatGPT was a couple years ago versus where we are now. Like, it feels like a lot of the angst amongst people is like, there's a lot happening. These technologies are moving quickly. Why isn't more being done to regulate it, to put some guardrails around it, to sort of think about the downstream implications of this? Social media obviously is a recent experience. I think that's with some people when you think about these kinds of questions.
Yeah, and so you're speaking about social media in particular of like, hey, we know some of these things are addictive. We kind of knew that, and we didn't put any guardrails around it, and now we're starting to see the pushback on this and the harm that it maybe does to consumers. Yeah, I think that's right. I think again, you have this weird paradox where the people that understand the technology at the deepest level are also the ones that would probably like the more looser regulatory structure, right? And so you kind of have this thing where the people that understand the technology at the deepest level maybe don't want the structure, and so we're forced to have kind of either journalists or people in general in society kind of push back with some of their discussions. And I think we're seeing that kind of AI backlash play out over the last 6 months or so. And I think you're right about the speed here is, you can actually track the improvement trajectory of some of these new technologies, right? So like, self-driving cars, there's a great metric, which is basically incidents per mile that these self-driving cars are driven. And you can see how the technology is improving because the number of incidents goes down, right? And so for AI, right, there's creating all these benchmarks for how fast the technology is improving. And it's not perfectly vertical, but it's a lot closer to vertical than it is to horizontal in terms of how fast these technologies are improving. Now, of course, there's a lot of money that's going into it too to get some of these gains. And so we don't really know, is it linear? Is it exponential? Is there some sort of like, flattening that's going to happen at some point where the more money is not necessarily going to to lead to that improvement? Are we just in that kind of hyper improvement phase, and then things are going to level off? And I think that's where there's a lot of angst around what that technology is going to do.
Yeah, it also feels like a very interesting moment for the industry at large, just because of you have OpenAI and Anthropic both talking about IPOs and going public, and a lot of interest in that. What do you make of this moment? I mean, these are companies that have not been able to generate a profit yet. They have, yeah, obviously have very capital intensive business models. You have also the whole data center conversation. What do you think about sort of financial dimensions to this?
Yeah, well, I have to go lean back on the framework, right? I just told you about the Pandora Spotify example, and we actually one of the things we do in our class is each week we have a discussion about current events, right? Where in addition to the case, right, a couple of the students will have read something in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and it'll have some sort of overlap with either the case or the framework or theory that we discussed in the class or we are going to discuss that day. And so in my, Pandora Spotify class, somebody brought in an article about, hey, we've got SpaceX, XAI, we've got OpenAI, and now we've got Anthropic that are all going to seemingly go public here. And Professor McDonald, aren't these like massive anomalies to the theory or framework that you're teaching us here about, good money is patient for growth and impatient for profit? These companies are doing the opposite of this, so what do we make of this? And I think it's really interesting when we teach that framework because the students' reactions are like super weird. Sometimes they think they love it. They think it's the best theory in the course. Other times they think it's the worst idea and it's totally outdated and makes no sense. And I couldn't figure this out for 5 years that I was teaching this. And then I realized that the students' reactions to the framework basically completely tracked the capital markets. And so when money was abundant and cheap, they thought this idea of being patient for growth and impatient for profit was a terrible idea, right? That's not how you do things. This is not how venture-backed startup works. And then meanwhile, if capital became less abundant or more expensive, they thought, oh, there's kind of some logic to this idea of figuring out the profit model. And I think right now we are in an environment where, at least money on the venture capital side for AI seems to be abundant and relatively cheap. And so none of these companies have really been forced to test the viability of their profit formula. In other words, if the money dried up, could you get profitable today? I would say that that argument is very hard to make. You're seeing a lot of discussion in the popular press around the amount of money that SpaceX has lost in the last couple of years. You're seeing a lot of discussion around, I see the growth happening for Anthropic and OpenAI, but they're spending a ton of money to get there, right? Is there ever going to be some sort of recognition or they're ever going to have to kind of come to terms with this? And I think it reminds me of Uber, 10 years ago when it was like, if you said, hey, does Uber really have a viable business model? You would just get laughed out of the room because it's like such a, ubiquitous service that everybody uses. Like, of course, they're going to kind of figure out the business model at some point. And we have some history for that, right? Google eventually figured out the business model. Facebook eventually figured out how to get profitable. But I think right now, I think people are thinking about this more in terms of growth and user experience than they are thinking about it in terms of, how can we get profitable? And the test will be, will the investors pony up those trillion-dollar valuations that these organizations want? And how long will they stay invested in the company as a result of this?
Yeah, it's interesting also to think about OpenAI, Anthropic. You talked about a duopoly, and not quite that with AI, but these are the leading companies and sort of competing with each other. And you've seen some different flare-ups, the government contract the thing that came up with the Department of Defense earlier. But like, how would you think like these two companies? What do you make of these two companies as they compete with each other for market share, for attention? What, as strategy professor, somebody who's very interested in disruptive strategy innovation, how do you think about these two companies relative to each other and their competition in the marketplace?
Yeah, well, I think my colleague, my former colleague Andy Wu at Harvard has written this really cool case on kind of the competition that's happening within the AI market itself. And I actually teach that case in our core strategy. class, and it's loosely focused on kind of Google. And the paradox here is that obviously Google's very early and invested in the technology that was AI, but they were sort of slow to commercialize it, or at least slower than OpenAI was to commercialize it. And you might say to yourself, well, why, right? If this is such an impactful technology. Well, you start digging into Google's business model a little bit, and you're like, okay, um, my business model is fantastic. It is printing money right now. And do I really want to be the pioneer of this new technology, which in some ways undermines part of my business model if I were to commercialize it? And so we sort of understand the innovator's dilemma in the context of Google about why it might have been slow to pioneer a technology that is clearly going to be valuable. And so the cool thing about that is you can sort of look at the competition between Google. It's kind of, the company that it supported or invested in, Anthropic, OpenAI, and the company that sort of invested in it, Microsoft. And you've just got this like really interesting incestuous relationship between all of these technology companies that all have like people that left one company and went to start the other company. You've got movement between AI scientists and these just unbelievable salaries being offered by Meta and others. And so you have this kind of game theoretic environment happening in a growth market in real time, where you have tentacles between investments and people moving in and out. I think it's a fascinating kind of strategic laboratory to look at some of these moves that these companies are making. We talked earlier about Boeing and Airbus and how you sort of put yourself in the shoes of your competitor and reason accordingly. That's really hard to do when the market is moving as fast as this one is. Obviously, you don't want to make a move without considering what your competitor is going to do. But if you make a move that's too slow, or you're doing too much analysis, right, you're going to get left behind. And so I think it's been a fascinating strategy laboratory to look at.
Is there anything else you're working on that you're thinking about these days that you would want to mention here?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about in our previous conversation, the intersection between AI and strategy, and that's obviously something that we think a lot about. We've done some research recently that was just published in Strategy Science called "Can AI Do Strategy?" And so the question for us was really, we know that AI is improving on a variety of different dimensions. It's getting better and better, but can it make decisions under uncertainty, which is basically what strategy is about. And so we did this. I think this is a pretty cool study where we have a business simulation that we teach in one of my elective courses that is focused on organizations trying to make a technology transition. And if you think about that, that's a really hard strategy problem, right? Let's say you're a combustion engine automobile maker that's trying to make the transition to electric, or you are, Netflix circa, 2010 that is trying to make the transition from DVD by mail to streaming, right? You're fundamentally making a technology transition. And the reason that's hard is because you have to invest in the core business or the old technology, while also simultaneously investing in and encouraging the new technology. And you got to somehow balance the timing and the investment across those different technologies. And so it's a really hard strategy problem. And that's what we do in the simulation. Is there's this kind of a technology transition that has to be made. And we've had students, MBA students, that have played the simulation for a couple of years. And so we can develop a human benchmark in terms of how good MBA students or executives are at making these kinds of technology transitions. It turns out that they're pretty good. They're not awesome, but they're pretty good at it. And then so what happens is, okay, well, we know AI is on a trajectory of improvement. How good is AI unaided by humans in making these kinds of technology transitions? In other words, how good is AI at strategy? So we have about 15 AI models, both proprietary models and open source models, that play this simulation. They get no pre-training. All of the simulation is masked to them, so they can't just kind of go back into their proprietary knowledge bases and pull it up. So they are encountering this strategic decision making under uncertainty task as if for the first time, exactly like a human would. And we look at how well the AI does on this. And what you find is pretty interesting. So we look at AI models from kind of 2023 up till late 2025. And what you find is that the models get better and better. So the models in 2023 are significantly worse than the sort of average executive slash MBA student. Then 2024, they get a little bit better. 2025, they're getting really good. But by about the early 2025, the models, particularly the proprietary models, actually outperform the executive slash MBA benchmark. And so now you're like, okay, now AI has clearly eclipsed humans when it comes to strategic decision making. This is terrible, right? This is hard, but it has implications. And then what we find is like in late 2025, as the frontier models are released, the so-called chain of reasoning models, they actually start doing worse on this particular task. So you go from better and better and better to worse. And you start saying to yourself, well, why is that? Why is that happening? That shouldn't be the case, right? Clearly this technology is improving. And what my co-author and I, Ryan Allen, what we speculate is that as these um, as these companies race to try to get the better and better models, they're comparing themselves across universally accepted benchmarks. Things like how well do you do on the LSAT exam, or the PhD science reasoning tests. And so they're optimizing their models to get ever better on these narrower and narrower benchmarks. And if you think about strategy, that's kind of the opposite, right? We don't have narrow benchmarks with really amazing data on all the historical things that companies have done. Oftentimes, these are decision-making tasks under uncertainty where we don't know what the right answer is, and we don't have a bunch of training data that we can feed into it. And so we're actually seeing the companies get worse on these dimensions. And I was telling you, Brett, that we do a lot of research um, at Darden. Some of the research just is read by 10 colleagues, somewhere in the world that really care about that esoteric topic. In this particular case, my co-author got invited to present the paper at OpenAI. And we had several engineers from Anthropic reach out to us and ask us for the code for this paper. So apparently this paper has kind of created some excitement at the industry level, and we hope to be able to have continue those conversations. And so that's been on my mind a lot.
That's awesome. Man, how interesting to think about. I mean, I do think this, like, what the humans will do, what the machines will do. This is like one of the central questions here in so many different ways. You have any thoughts on that, where that might go?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously doing some other work that I just described, kind of human benchmark versus AI decisions. We're doing some more work. Mike Lennox and I are doing some work with Mael Perez, who's a doctoral student at Darden, trying to understand the intersection between the human, the AI, and sort of theories or frameworks or mental models, the kinds of things that we would teach at in an MBA program, and how that affects strategic decision making. We're finding some very interesting roles of the synergistic effect of some of the tools and frameworks, and the ability for humans to interact with AI in really productive ways. So forthcoming, I'll let you know when that stuff is closer to being published.
Well, Roy, thank you for your time today. We always wrap up by asking same last question. For folks who've gotten interested in the topics, are there a couple, two, three books you might recommend for people for additional reading?
Yeah, sure. So I think the classic one is sort of the innovator's dilemma that Clay Christensen wrote a few years ago. There's a follow on, the innovator solution, that I think is quite good. More recently, I would say, you would be a bad marketer if you didn't hawk your own book in a setting like this. And so I have a book called that came out a couple of years ago called Productive Tensions: How Every Leader Can Tackle Innovation's Toughest Trade-Offs. And you'll get a little bit of kind of disruptive strategy or disruptive innovation thinking out of that book. But I think, lots of cool, interesting books by Darden faculty. I'd recommend Radical Doubt by Bobby Parmar, who it just came out like a few months ago, which is really interesting, kind of ethics meets cognition in decision making. And obviously, any book called Radical Doubt has got to be interesting. So those are a few that I would recommend.
Well, Roy, thank you again for your time. And to our attendees, thank you so much for being here. As always, we were recording today's conversation. We'll share the video out on our Vimeo channel, the Darden MBA channel. You can find it on our admission site. We'll also share the audio on our podcast. We have two podcasts, the ExecMBA podcast, which is focused on the professional degree experience, as well as Experience Darden, which is focused on our full-time MBA experience. I'll just one more plug for Office Hours. We got a session coming up later this month, Friday, June 26th, with Anthony Palumba. He's been on Office Hours before, but it's been a few weeks. We're excited to have him come back. So, Rory, thank you again. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Brett. Take care.
All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you so much. And that was my conversation with Rory McDonald, a member of the Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship faculty here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.